do it. Good afternoon. We're delighted to have a full house. My name is Melinda Herring. I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. We are delighted to be joining the Energy Center and the Economic Sanctions Initiative at the Atlantic Council. So this is an effort of more than one center here today. This week, the Senate passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which contains provisions to impose sanctions on companies installing deep-sea pipelines for Russia's $10.5 billion Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which links Russia and Germany, as I know everyone is aware in this room. And the president is expected to sign Ndaa any minute. We're delighted to have four top experts with us to discuss its implications. To my left is Annie Freilich, a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council and a private attorney at Latham & Watkins. Next to her is Ambassador Daniel Fried, with the Waiver Family Distinguished Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. To my left is Ambassador John Herbst, the Director of the Eurasia Center. And on my far left is Ambassador Richard L. Morningstar, the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. So we have assembled a panel with a lot of differing views. So I think this is going to be a fantastic panel. I'd like to open and ask Ambassador Herbst to just frame this issue for us. Why is Nord Stream 2 a threat to European security and U.S. interests in Europe? Why should we care?
It's a pleasure to be here, and I haven't felt this outnumbered since I last appeared on Russian state TV. But I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues. This is a critical issue for a relatively simple reason. The Kremlin is determined to exert its influence in Europe by weakening the EU, as well as weakening NATO, and reestablishing its suzerainty over the nations whom it had fully in its thrall, 40 years ago. And right now, the Kremlin supplies, 200 BCMs of gas to Europe last year. And it would like to be able to do that in ways that increases its leverage over the countries in between itself and the rest of Europe. Or rather, I should say, Western Europe. And the best way to do that is to have a pipeline that goes around Ukraine, Poland, Belarus. So it can play games with energy supply with those countries and push it in directions it wants to go. Nord Stream 2 is not a commercial project. It's a geopolitical project whose aim is directly at our strategic heart. And there's no way in the world we should let this happen.
Terrific. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Annie, could you please summarize what's in the Ndaa bill and what these sanctions are intended to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just hit the highlights because there are a number of complicated provisions. But as a general matter, the bill is aimed at the vessels that are currently engaged in the pipeline portion of the projects that are being targeted. It provides that within 60 days of enactment, the Secretary of State, in consultation with the Secretary of Treasury, shall identify these particular vessels. Again, they're engaged. These are the vessels that are engaged in laying pipe at depths of 100 feet or more, as well as the parties that have sold, leased, or otherwise provided the vessels in connection with these targeted projects. So that's what the focus of these sanctions is. And that's, again, within 60 days of signing, which is expected near term. There is the possibility that companies that have demonstrated good faith efforts to engage in winding down these activities may be eligible to avoid the imposition of sanctions. And they have 30 days to demonstrate, post-enactment, 30 days to demonstrate those good faith wind down activities. In terms of what the sanctions would entail, they would basically make ineligible for certain visa eligibility the parties that are targeted. So the parties would be ineligible to receive visas to enter the United States or other benefits of eligibility of entrance into the U.S. It would be effective immediately. So current visas that the parties already hold could be revoked immediately. And then there are also blocking actions that could result from these sanctions. So the parties that are targeted, to the extent they have property in the United States, or if that property otherwise comes into the United States or comes into the possession or control of U.S. persons, could be subject to blocking. There are a couple of important exceptions that I wanted to note here for certain types of activities that are expressly carved out of this bill. Among them, the safety of passengers and crew on the vessels are excepted from these sanctions. There's also an important exception for the repair and maintenance of the vessels, as well as for the importation of goods in connection with these construction projects. And also importantly, there is the provision for a national interest waiver. So if the president demonstrates a rationale for waiving these sanctions in the national interest, the bill provides for him to do that.
Terrific, Andy. Thank you. Ambassador Freed, you are Mr. Sanctions. Could you give us a quick thumbnail? Is this a good bill? What do you think about it overall?
Is this a good bill? It is a thoughtful bill. That is, its targets are narrowly constructed and limited. It is focused on one issue, and the various carve-outs in the waiver provisions suggests that it is meant seriously as legislation as opposed to being a messaging bill. So that's good. But I agree with John that Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea. I was no bigger a fan of Nord Stream 1. The question is whether sanctioning in pursuit of this laudable objective, that is hitting Nord Stream, whether sanctions against Western firms are the proper way to go. And that's an interesting question. I think the German government made a mistake backing Nord Stream. I think they were just wrong. But the fact that they were wrong doesn't mean that the Germans are the problem. The Russians, the Kremlin is the problem. It is their aggression and their use of energy as a coercive tool that we're worried about. So the problem with this sanctions bill, as thoughtful as it is, and it's a serious piece of work, as thoughtful as it is, it goes against the Germans and thereby pits the United States against Germany when the actual, the proper targets are the Russians. So I'm not a big fan of the bill, though I think the authors of it are after the right objective, and they have crafted a bill with diligence, but I don't think it's the right approach. And I say this as somebody who is in general a supporter of sanctions against the Russians for various things, including their invasion of Ukraine and their continued pressure against it. So this is not an argument that we have to make up with Russia. That's not my point. My point is that the tool may be misplaced, as serious as it is as an instrument.
Thanks. And we're going to come back to you
Right.
and have you unpack
Right,
your
right.
argument.
Yeah.
I just want to bring Ambassador Morningstar in here. So the big debate that I've seen in the press is that people are arguing that Nord Stream 2 is nearly finished. What do you think of that argument? Is it too little too late at this point for sanctions to have an impact?
I don't know.
I thought you were an expert.
No, I really don't know, and I'll explain why. As I understand it, if I have the facts right from what I've been reading, there are about 300 kilometers left that need to be done in laying the pipeline. That the question is, assuming that the Western company withdraws from working on the pipeline, how long it would take for Gazprom to find a company, a Russian company or whoever who would not be afraid of the sanctions to come in and complete the pipeline. There's a real question as to how much technology there presently is in Russia to do that. Russia would say right now, well, gee, it's no problem, we'll finish it quickly. We'll see. It's a question. The law is a little more draconian than it is looked at in first instance, in that that any company such as, what's the name of it, Allseas? Allseas company, that is working on that pipeline, in order to qualify to be exempt from the sanctions, has to start winding down on the date of enactment. So to be safe, that company would have to stop, or at least start pulling back immediately, which does raise more questions as to how long a delay would be. Now, there's also a loophole in the Act, which I think, Annie, you mentioned, that repair and maintenance of the pipeline would be exempt. Well, I suppose Russia could put down a lousy pipeline and then call back in Allseas to repair or maintain it. So, that's a possible out. We don't know what the president might do with respect to a waiver. If a waiver, one could make a national security argument for a waiver. People may or may not agree with it, but then politically it might be, with everything else going on, that might be difficult right now. But those kinds of things haven't stopped the president before, so it's hard to know what the president might do in that case. A waiver would be lifted under certain circumstances, but if the waiver were in effect for any significant period of time, the project would probably be completed anyway. I think there's sort of a bottom line to all this. The bottom line is that what should be done and what can best encourage Russia, Gazprom, and Ukraine to come to a binding, reasonable deal for the continuation of transit through Ukraine. And do sanctions like this help or hurt that process? Hopefully, if they go into effect, it could help that process. And then people say, well, if there's a deal, Russia's never going to comply. You could have such a thing as contingency sanctions. Like if sanctions get below, if transit goes below a certain level through Ukraine, then maybe sanctions go into effect. I think it's also somewhat significant that Germany has had sort of a low-key reaction to this bill. They haven't necessarily had a low-key reaction to the whole Nord Stream question, but they certainly have with respect to this bill. Now, I don't know if that means that they think it's not a big deal and it's going to be completed soon anyway, or they don't want another big issue with the United States, and they say, well, we want to talk to the United States about it. But the main thing is, if this could drive us towards some kind of deal, I think with possibly contingent sanctions, that could be the most helpful outcome. And the last quick point I'll make: Europe is making some progress through alternative sources, alternative infrastructure, including LNG, including what they're doing on decarbonization, to reduce the dependence and to force Russia to act competitively and to keep prices down, given alternative sources of gas. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you so much, Dick. Ambassador Herbst, too little, too late for sanctions to work? Where are you on this?
It's certainly not too little, and it's not too late, although it's later than I would like it to be. As Dick mentioned, the most important thing is that the sanctions go into effect once the president signs it. Mm-hmm. And so that will happen presumably in the next week or two. And there are estimates about how long it's going to take to complete the pipeline, but none of those estimates suggest it's going to happen in the next 10 days. So it's highly likely that this will be enforced before the pipeline is concluded. Therefore, if this is passed, signed, and implemented, it will stop Nord Stream 2 at least for a good bit of time. And we don't know what technology Moscow could come up with if Allseas prudently backs out. And the punishment for going ahead is so high, I think we should expect them to back out. We do know regarding Russian capability, until this point in time, they have always relied on Western technology for the hard-to-get hydrocarbons. So to my mind, it's not realistic to expect this pipeline to be completed, certainly in the next year or two, without high-duty, advanced Western technology.
Great, thank you. Annie, what impact will would these sanctions have on the pipeline and on business in general? I know you've done some thinking about this.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I may, if I may, take a little bit of a different tack than the others here in terms of the potential impact of these sanctions. I don't know that it is likely to have a material impact on the project. It does come into effect upon the president's signature, but the Department of State, in consultation with Treasury, does have 60 days to identify the sanctions targets. We've heard a lot, we know a bit about who's involved in the projects at present, and we can certainly make predictions as to who is likely to be targeted by these particular sanctions. But there are a lot of questions about, who exactly will fall into that scope and what the sanctions will look like. And as has been noted so far, the projects, as far as I understand, are in their advanced stages. I believe TurkStream is near completion. Nord Stream 2 is not far off. And it may very well be that the sanctions do not have enough of a bite to actually have a meaningful chilling effect on the construction activities. So I may venture that they are not likely, as a practical matter, to have a real material impact on the completion of the construction. I think another important point is that the sanctions are fairly targeted, as we've discussed. They're aimed at the vessels that are involved in laying pipe at depths of 100 or more feet below sea level, as well as the parties that are selling, leasing, providing these vessels. So they are very narrow in scope. There are also some critical exceptions that we've talked about as well for maintenance and repair activities, as well as for the importation of goods. And so in that respect, there are certain aspects of the projects that would not be covered by these sanctions. The scope is, somewhat limited, which I think further reduces the imminency of the threat of sanctions, notwithstanding the fact that they would become enacted after the signing of the bill. The other point I would make is that this project has been the source of a lot of discourse and controversy. It's certainly been part of the dialogue, and companies in the oil and gas industry may very well have taken these factors into account in connection with their internal business decision making and their risk calculus. And so they may already have taken steps to think about things and change their business activities in anticipation of potential sanctions around these projects. And so for those reasons, I might predict that they are less likely to have a real material impact on the project. But it is always, with some degree of caution that I make predictions in this day and age.
That's probably wise. Ambassador Fried, you recently wrote a blog post, and you said a number of interesting things. You said that sanctions may not block Nord Stream 2 and may burden the U.S.-German relationship. Why won't they work? What other concerns do you have?
I don't know whether the sanctions will work. John could well be right that the threat of sanctions may be enough to get all seas to back off.
Okay.
But then the scenario that Dick Morningstar laid out clicks in. The Russians could use their own technical resources, lay pipe, which is bad, knowing that they could use the environmental remediation carve-out as a backup to repair it. Now, there's an uncertainty as to whether this would work. But if were I in my former job as sanctions coordinator at State, what I would do is use that uncertainty and the leverage the uncertainty gives us, and then approach the European Union and the Germans with the offer of a kind of a deal, which is contingency sanctions. But let me explain some of the context. The EU deserves enormous credit for policies over the past 10 years which mitigate Russian energy and particularly gas leverage over Europe. Its third energy package, its system of reverse pipelines, the development of LNG facilities, which has been done by the Poles and Lithuanians especially, have meant that Europe is in far better shape than it was in the mid-2000s, when Russia could cut gas supplies to Ukraine and put pressure on Central Europe. Curiously, the Act makes reference to this both in the preamble and in an odd sunset clause provision which allows for the phase out of sanctions if the president can certify that Russia no longer has energy leverage, which suggests that the authors of the bill are cognizant of the fact that the problem is not just simply Russian gas supplies to Europe, but Russian strategic leverage over Europe and Central Europe in particular using those gas supplies. So what do you do with that? And the deal I would try to put together would be for the U.S. to back off of use of the sanctions against the companies and against the pipeline, but in return for which we would put down unilateral contingency sanctions based, inspired partly by the bill's own language, that if the Russians cut gas flows to Ukraine or to Poland or basically anywhere else in Europe for no good reason, you'd find legislative language to define no good reason, for arbitrary reasons, then the contingent sanctions would go into effect, and you'd probably add a second catch-all criterion that if the Russians otherwise used gas as political leverage over Europe, the contingency sanctions would go into effect, and then you would have to develop actual contingency sanctions. And you could do this. I mean, when we were devising the sanctions against Russia after its invasion of Ukraine in 2014, we didn't go after gas industry itself. We didn't go after Gazprom itself. Well, you make a decision, you make a new decision under different circumstances. We could go after Gazprom not to cut off daily sales of gas, we'd never do that, but to cut off additional sources of financing, debt and equity restrictions. We could impose debt and equity restrictions and other restrictions to make it hard for Gazprom to do gas exploration, similar to what we've done in oil. And we could lay out these sanctions on a national, that is unilateral basis, but hopefully get the Germans and the EU to either join with us, knowing that the circumstances under which we would move would be those in which Russia had increased gas, energy and gas pressure against Ukraine or European Union members. And we'd be in a position to tell the Germans, behind closed doors, yeah, we told you so. And then to get the Germans and the EU to either join with us or to simply not yell too much when we impose these sanctions. Now, that, it is not wholly satisfying because it presupposes the Nord Stream 2 is completed, but that might happen anyway. And I want to use the uncertainty we have now about the impact of the sanctions to get the best possible deal in the service of the overall strategic objective, which is to prevent the Russians from exercising energy leverage over Ukraine and Central Europe, and to punish them if they do, to hit them hard if they do. And in general, in sanctions, the punishment you prepare needs to be strong enough that it'll hurt, but not so strong that you actually can't do it. You have to be able to do it. You don't bluff, because then your bluff is called. Anyway, that's Dick Morningstar and I have been kicking this idea around for some time. Yeah, right. And the time may come. Now, I know this presupposes that the Trump administration could actually talk to the Germans without, making everybody mad, but there are good people in the administration who are actually capable of doing this. Anyway, that's basically what I argue in the piece. That's not the only solution, but I was trying to come up with some way ahead that respected the Hunger Games principle. Remember who the real enemy is, right? It's not Germany. Even though we may be mad at the German government for Nord Stream 2, they are not the villain here. The Kremlin is the villain, and we need to figure out a way to maximize the people on our side, the better to put pressure on them.
Great, thank you, Dan. John, I wanted to go back to one of Dan's concerns. So he was afraid that these sanctions would burden the U.S.-German relationship. Can you comment on that?
There are several things that need to be said here. First, Dan's right that we have to consider the U.S.-German relationship. Therefore, we have to have a good plan of action for what we do when we spring sanctions to kill Nord Stream 2. And in fact, the Defense Authorization Act partly does that, because we're not sanctioning anyone who's German. We're sanctioning a Swiss firm. That's the first point. Second point, we need to understand that while Germany is not the enemy here, of course not, or even the adversary, they're also not our pal. Or for that matter, the pal of people in Europe who want energy security. And first of all, they would not have gone down this road had they been. But we've had reminders of that as recently as this fall, because in the spring, the EU put out a new directive which would have applied internal EU gas regulations to pipelines coming from non-EU parties. And when this was submitted to the Bundestag, the way the directive was originally written, this applies to all things that were completed, I think it was by May 23rd. But suddenly when it went to the Bundestag, literally 23 minutes before it was introduced, that clause was dropped. What was the German government doing when they dropped that clause? They were bowing deeply in the direction of Gazprom and the Kremlin, not in a way that's friendly to the interest of Europe. So it is the height of hypocrisy for the Germans to say this issue needs to be decided in Europe, not by the United States, when in fact they're deciding this in Berlin, not in Brussels. So let's understand the factors. But here's the last point, and the most important point. I am delighted to be up here with Dan, who is a great national asset and has done wonderful things, including in the sanctions field. You're right, Dan. You got me.
There's a reason why I'm sitting between the two of them.
That's true. Sometimes, over the last few minutes, I didn't think I was listening to Dan Fried. I thought I was listening to Rube Goldberg. And here's the point. Oh, you have to be a certain age to understand that.
Can you explain that?
Rube Goldberg was the creator of these enormously complicated contraptions to get something from A to B. And here's the relevant point for us. If you work in the government, if you work in politics, you know that to be effective, you have to have an idea that is simple, comprehensible, and timely. That's what the clause that was put into the NDAA on Nord Stream 2 was. Dan's ideas are great, but tactically they are not going to succeed. The hour is late. Let's go with the horse that's in the race and take care of it. But I would love to add Dan's ideas to the follow-up package.
Okay. Ambassador Morningstar, jump in.
I guess I'd be a little more nuanced, and I think I think there is a way. There is a way, not that easy, to get from A to B. I think to get from A to B, first, I think it is helpful, frankly, if Nord Stream 2 gets delayed for some significant period of time, whether it be through these sanctions, whether it be through the necessity on the negotiation and implementation of the amendments to the third energy package in Europe, whether it be as a result of ramifications of the Opal decision by the European Court of Justice, which we can get into the details, but probably not worth it right now. The point being that if, in fact, there is a delay in Nord Stream 2, that puts pressure on because of the end of the transit agreement this December between Gazprom and Ukraine. There's a problem. If, in fact, we get to January 1st and there is storage and so forth, that at some point, unless there's an agreement between Gazprom and Naftagaz, or Gazprom and Ukraine, there could be a gas shutoff. And there's going to be a lot of pressure to come to some kind of deal. And if, in fact, all of these factors, including these sanctions, can push the parties to come to a reasonable agreement, which may be enforced by the contingent sanctions that Dan and I Dan was talking about, and that Dan and I think, pretty much agree on. That could be a good thing. And that what we need to do, rather than getting into a conflict with Germany or anybody else with respect to these sanctions, and Germany has had a low-key response to this, to start talking to them in this way. And say, yeah, okay, the sanctions are going to go into effect. You've got all these other issues with respect to Nord Stream 2 in Europe. There are going to be delays. We've got to work together to force an agreement that is a meaningful agreement and subject to some kind of enforcement. So maybe it's being Pollyanna-ish, but let's look at this maybe as an opportunity and not necessarily something that's just going to create a lot of chaos.
No? No? You're going to resist? Okay.
I've had my say.
Did you want to come in?
No, there's a deal that wants, I think there's a deal that wants to happen. It could involve contingency sanctions. It should be built on the realization that the EU has made significant and laudable progress in undercutting Russian energy leverage over Europe. The Germans have played both sides of this game. They have protected Nord Stream, including through this, the legislative maneuvers that John outlined, and he's right about that. On the other hand, they have backed all of the EU, in general, the EU energy provisions. So, the United States could come in and try to craft a deal which puts us in better shape with respect to overall Russian energy leverage over Europe and supports the Ukrainians. That may be complicated, but with all Rube Goldberg, I don't know that it's quite that complicated. And if a straight line leads to a U.S.-German clash and puts the Ukrainians, who've had quite enough of unneeded pressure from Washington, in the position of now having to choose between the United States and Germany, that's a lot to ask. So I come out for at least an attempt to craft something together that gets us to a better place rather than and use the leverage of the legislation to try to get there. Who knows where we're going to end up, but I sense opportunity.
I did want to challenge you, though. I'm not the sanctions guru, but I spoke to a couple of people about the national security waiver.
Yeah.
You were advocating that might be something to think about. Politically, how can Trump do this after he said so many things against the project? And my understanding is that the national security waiver is formally included in every piece of sanctions legislation and isn't really used. The national security waiver is often this is a relatively loose, liberal waiver provision. Okay. It's often tougher. I think Annie knows the details of this, but often national security waiver provisions are harder, higher standard. This is a relatively loose one. And if Trump first of all, you're asking me whether he would be embarrassed by inconsistency? No. I know. No. But I think you're right that there would be an immediate issue of his credibility. Yes. Because he would be accused of bowing down. Someone would say he's bowing down to his masters in the Kremlin or something like that. Yeah. There would be a partisan attack against him immediately, which is why the exercise of the waiver provision would have to be coupled with contingency, the announcement of our readiness to implement tougher contingency sanctions, and hopefully, some understanding with the Europeans, but in any event, the determination to do that. But if the problem is public acceptance, that's
that's a workable problem.
Okay.
I don't think the waiver would help. In fact, it could, forgetting whether Trump would exercise it or not, and who knows. But that I would argue that exercising the waiver could be detrimental, because I think the idea, the problem is if the waiver is in effect, let's say for a year or year and a half before there's any real progress made, then it may be, the cow will be out of the barn, the project will be complete, and it'll be too late. I would be against him exercising the waiver, because I think we need to have the most pressure possible to get to the deal. And I think part of it would be and I think that the pressure is going to be delay. And if these sanctions help delay for a period of time, along with the other things I mentioned, and you're absolutely right about Europe's in better shape, and Europe's done a lot to mitigate the effects of Nord Stream and so forth, I guess I would be against the waiver. I'd be for contingency sanctions with a deal, but all the pressure needs to be applied to get to that deal.
Annie?
Yeah, I'm thinking this through a bit. I mean, I completely agree that I think that the exercise of the waiver at this stage is likely to be tough, given sort of the previous statements around this. So I see that being a very unlikely outcome here.
And given the votes that we've seen on the Hill as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, maybe. And use of contingency, but think about use of contingency sanctions without a waiver. If there's a deal, what's our part? What do we put into it?
Is that directed at John?
No, I mean, it's a general question. If you don't put in the waiver and Nord Stream 2 is completed anyway, you may have lost some leverage. So I'm not sure that it's fatal. But in any event, I think the administration, whatever it decides to do on the waiver, I think the key task is to broaden the discussion so that you have more German, more US, more EU emphasis on mitigation measures to reduce Russian energy leverage, so the downside risks of Nord Stream are not as important. Now, the Germans, months, over the past year, have been talking loosely and informally about ways to guarantee gas flows through Ukraine. And the issue of a guarantee means what? If the Russians violate it, what's the penalty? And the penalty could be contingency sanctions. And if the Germans were to agree to that, that's a major step forward. US, European, German help with the EU putting through contingency sanctions. Anyway, this is all sanctions. I mean, sanctions policy involves discussions just like this. And I don't know, I have no idea how the administration will come out, but it's important to have this kind of a discussion, because the usual discussion, are you too soft on the Kremlin? Are you standing up for Ukraine? Doesn't really get you to where we need to be, which is sustainable policy. So the kind of discussion we're having here is intended to lay the basis for that. And if anybody in the administration is listening, feel free to take down all the ideas. And please use them.
Thank you.
Any of them.
Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, yesterday there was an article that 2 U.S. officials said that it's too late. What are you hearing about the attitudes within the U.S. government? Is that true? Does the U.S. government view this as a done deal?
My understanding is that the whole interagency favors this, meaning sanctioning companies involved, or the company involved in Nord Stream 2, with the exception of the Treasury Department. And anyone needs to read our newspapers understanding that some leaks are designed to inform and influence. So they don't say who those officials are, but I'd be willing to wager half a year's salary that they're from the Treasury Department, reflecting the reluctance of the Secretary of the Treasury and his chief officials to do sanctions, usually of any kind, but especially in this field. And let's remember that they've embarrassed themselves twice on the subject. First, when they came out with that ridiculous no real list of people to sanction in Russia, I think that was in early 18, and then they came out with a list which included sanctions which led to chaos in the aluminum market, which for them was confirmation bias that you shouldn't do sanctions. So we can dismiss those senior officials as special pleaders.
Okay.
And Senators Cruz and Johnson, in their letter, made it abundantly clear that their view of the legislative intent was that companies involved in laying the pipe had to start winding down on day one in order to qualify to be exempt from sanctions once the list comes out, 60 days later and so forth. For example, if all seas just kept going strongly for 60 days, and even if it were completed, in theory, I'm not saying it would be, but even if it were, that under the provisions, they still could be sanctioned if they hadn't tried to wind down during the initial period, from day one.
And that's why I think it's not too late, and this will actually stop Nord Stream in its tracks, at least for a good length of time.
Maybe, maybe not, but I will still argue for consideration of the waiver, because that gives us, if we have exercised sanctions, it may be harder to get the Germans to come around to this understanding or to help us with the contingency sanctions.
But if we issue the waiver and the project is completed, one, you have to get the contingency sanctions through, but aren't you, what does that, what's the symbol of that if we issue a waiver, and from the standpoint of putting pressure on to come to a deal? We have to keep looking at and I think we agree on what the end result is. I think we agree 100% on what the end result ought to be. The question is how to get there, and I think we could argue back and forth whether a waiver would be helpful or not to get there.
Well, fair enough, and an alternative, there's, nothing lasts like the provisional. So, you don't decide, but you hold out the possibility of sanctions. You work hard for a deal, and you see where we are with Altstream. If Altstream backs off and you have some more time, you see what you can put together. But in the end, suppose the Germans say, we're willing to sign on to contingency sanctions, but you have to let Nord Stream through. You have to let Nord Stream 2 through. I mean, that I don't want to get to that point now. That's a hypothetical, but when you start down the road, we better be thinking about all of the alternatives.
If we were talking about this a year ago, Dan, I might be able to agree with you. But right now, we don't have time for your approach, unless, for example, and this is really deep in the theoretical clouds, the Germans were willing to insist that current work on Nord Stream 2 cease while we negotiate this with them. Oh, no, of course not.
Well, I mean, the issue is, how do we best advance the real objective, which is weakening Russian energy leverage over Europe? What combination of sanctions, threat of sanctions, support for Ukraine, pushing the EU energy policy forward, and other initiatives like the 3 Seas initiatives, which has a component part on energy infrastructure. What is the best combination to achieve the result? That's the issue, and the issue of sanctions should be relegated to a tactic within that larger debate. And when it's not clear what tactics you should use, it's best to try to reframe the question so that a fight over tactics is not the most important fight. You start finding areas of common approach, build on that, bring in the Ukrainians, and make sure at the end of the day it is not the U.S. This story we have failed if the story ends up being a U.S.-German fight over Russia policy. That's a bad outcome, and I'm eager to avoid it if we can, but not at the cost of hurting Ukraine. Now, what's in that space when you get those overlapping diagrams, I'm not sure. I think contingency sanctions are part of it.
By the way, just one other quick point as to why a deal does make sense is every company that I've spoken to, now they may be blowing smoke, I don't know, but they keep saying that transit through Ukraine is going to continue to be necessary. And so fine. They say it needs to happen. Let's get that deal done.
Do you believe that? Do you think that
all this conversation reminds me of the story about 3 economists on a desert island with a can of Coke, and they want to open it, and one of them says, "I've got the solution." He says, "Assume a can opener." In other words, we're assuming things which we don't have. And what we don't have most of all is time. And if we could put Dan Fried in a time machine and send him back 18 months and make him the sanctions czar, he could have worked out this deal by this past summer, and we'd be in a place to do it. But what we have now is essentially status quo doing nothing or riding this bill and doing what's necessary. And I believe we can do that. There is the danger of a rupture with Germany, which I think is manageable because there are sane voices in Germany. It's worth remembering that AKK got in trouble a few months ago, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, for saying the obvious. This is a geopolitical project, and she got slapped down, but it's clear there are people in Germany who understand this. And let's remember that this is not something that's even in the economic interest of Russia. As an analysis, it was on the blog of Bank 18 months ago. This is in the interest of the cronies of Putin economically, and of course of Kremlin imperial interest. So let's shut this thing down, work hard on dealing with the Germans, which I admit is also a little bit of an assumption given the current situation in Washington. But that to me is the only way to go to achieve our objective of preventing this imposition of a Kremlin instrument on the energy future of Europe.
Okay, so we need many can openers. Now it is time to bring in our audience. But before you do, I neglected to ask you to do something important. A lot of cell phones have been going on. If you would please turn off your cell phone, your ringer, I would be very, very grateful. So I'm going to ask for hands. Before we give you a microphone, or as the microphone arrives, please give us your name, your affiliation, and please ask a question. A question has a question mark. Please, no big statements. If I can have my microphones, I have a gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, everyone. My name is Vadim Glamazdin. I'm Special Envoy on Government Relations of Naftogaz of Ukraine. First of all, I will come up with a question pretty soon, but I definitely have to, first of all, thank to the United States Congress for what they've done with respect to sanctions and with respect to dealing with this project, which is definitely far, far away from any economic issue. Specifically, Senators Cruz, Shaheen, and others who were initiating the bill, but the entire Congress for doing this, and we are very much waiting for the President to sign it and to enact. I very much appreciate also everything that was sent now, but with all due very big respect to all the panelists, I want to say these were all very good theoretic things, but as representative of someone who is living practically with Gazprom and with everything related to such project, I want to do, before making my question clear, I want to do just a couple remarks. Remark number one, let's not push this misconception that the sanctions are against Germany and that there is any German interest in that particular project. If you look back at what happened at the end of 18 and beginning 19, when European Parliament passed a resolution, 2 resolutions actually, both of them literally said that Nord Stream 2 is a project that has to be stopped. In the last resolution, 90% of all German members of European Parliament voted for this resolution. So let's not mix things with few voices that getting to the German government from some industrial lobby with the entire German position.
What's the question, though?
Yeah, then
You can follow up and have a discussion afterwards
Sure.
with our panelists.
The question, if we say that sanctions are too late, too little, maybe waived, maybe blocked, and will not give a result, then why the hysteria? Russians are being hysteric now, especially in the media, saying that United States is killing transatlantic relations, is killing whatever else. German government, speaking of Ambassador Morningstar's comment, it may be low-key here, the reaction may be low-key here, but in Ukraine, our government got very, very angry and very specific statements from German embassy and from some representatives of German government due to this particular issue. So why the hysteria then?
Great, we got it. Why the hysteria? Who wants to take that?
I mean, I concede your premise. For the Russians, stopping Nord Stream 2 is I shouldn't say for the Russians, for the Kremlin, stopping Nord Stream 2 is a huge hit. And for those in Germany who've aligned themselves, at least subjectively, or objectively rather, with Kremlin interests, it's a huge hit. But I also agree with you, I think this is manageable if we do this with the Germans.
Okay. Ambassador Vershball right here.
Sandy Vershbow at the Atlantic Council. It seems to me we were setting somewhat diffuse objective here of reducing Russian energy leverage, and ultimately we're not going to succeed. But sooner or later this is going to get completed. If it's a 2-month delay, a 6-month delay, even a 12-month delay, I mean, this is not the most sophisticated technology. The Russians will figure out how to lay the pipe if Western companies are no longer able to do. Why don't we set a much more discrete, finite objective relating to Ukraine, which is to use the leverage we have by creating this delay to push the Europeans and the Russians into making a long-term deal with the Ukrainians on gas transit. Not even a 3-year deal. How about a 10-year deal, which guarantees, with severe penalties on Russia if they renege on the deal, guarantees continued use of the Ukrainian gas transit system? Wouldn't that be a net win? And we'll just have to find other ways to fight the continued fight on reducing Russian energy leverage on Europe.
Yeah, that's. Sandy, I agree with you that Nord Stream 2 is likely to be completed one way or another. The question is, what do we do about it? I like the idea of a goal of guaranteed gas transit, but I would broaden that. I would look for ways to not only guarantee or support continued Russian gas transit through Ukraine, but to prevent the Russians from cutting off other countries, Belarus, the Baltics, and using contingency sanctions to that effect. That's the purpose of the best parts of Europe, of EU energy policy, and of US policy for years. So focus on that objective, but you're right. I'd like to think that we could block Nord Stream 2. It's a bad idea. If we can't, and I think it arguable that we cannot, what do we do about it to prevent the Russians from using Nord Stream 2 as they intend, which is an arm of their leverage?
I agree that the solution you propose in the long run makes sense. But to get there, you want to stop Nord Stream 2 now. And while I agree with you that over time the Russians can develop that technology, that time may be 3 or 4 years. They've relied on Western technology for all the heavy-duty hydrocarbon drilling and such forever. So it's hard to imagine that tomorrow they're going to pull out the capability that All Seas has right now. And stopping them for the foreseeable future may well be the best way to get the deal you want.
As a tool that we haven't talked about in this discussion too is whether, to the extent that Russia is that significantly reliant on Western technology, another tool at our disposal may be some sort of export controls around technology and items that may be going to Russia for these purposes. And we have some precedent for that. We have seen the Department of Commerce impose licensing restrictions. Relevant here perhaps is in connection with the same non-conventional oil projects, the deep water, Arctic offshore, and shale, that are the focus of OFAC's Directive 4. And we've also seen, of course, Commerce take other, outside of the context of oil and gas, impose other restrictions that may effectuate U.S. Policy purposes. Recently, we've seen a lot of export restrictions imposed on Huawei and other Chinese companies, for example, that do have a very significant chilling effect on the ability of those companies to receive items that are subject to U.S. jurisdiction and that have the ability to really advance these types of activities. So that may be another tool at our disposal that we could think about utilizing to achieve these objectives.
I agree completely, and contingency sanctions ought to be considered, including those technology restrictions. We've got some in under Directive 4 for oil. We could increase them. There's actually quite a bit we could do to hit the Russian energy sector, not for current sales, but for future development, which is, if you want to have contingency sanctions that work over time, that could be a direction to go.
Great, thank you. This gentleman right here.
I'm Branko Terzic. I'm former commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which regulates pipelines. I'm also an engineer and a senior fellow here at the council. I just checked on the internet. There's at least 8 pipe-laying barges available used, and it's not fracking, it's not unique American technology, welding pipes, pretty well known in Russia. My question to you is, would the sanctions work if tomorrow Allseas announced they're getting out of the business and they're selling that particular ship to Gazprom and they're walking away from it?
At that point, I don't know, it depends on the deal. I would turn to somebody like Annie Froelich for a legal analysis, and I would also, were I in government, I would get the OFAC enforcement people on the case. It is very deal dependent. I suspect that the technology, I doubt if the technology for the deep sea pipe laying is unique, which I believe it is. I doubt that companies are going to be willing to simply give it away to Gazprom, and if they have some kind of a cutout, complicated arrangement by which they pretend to give it to Gazprom to avoid sanctions, but they keep ultimate control, they can be hit, and OFAC enforcement will enjoy doing so.
Yes, in good faith.
Yeah.
Determined that they're not acting in good faith in doing that, it's a legal question, but they would assumedly still be subject to sanctions.
It's a legal, but it's also a political question, because if this were to happen the way you described it, even assuming they gave up actual control of this, I would imagine policymakers who want to stop the project would make sure their lawyers develop arguments that this is just a ruse to get around sanctions and slam them.
Let's ask an actual lawyer.
No, I think that sounds right. I mean, I don't think just merely.
What court do you go to for that?
OFAC could make the case. They don't have to go to court. They can hit them. And then the burden is on the company, and OFAC doesn't lose cases. I'm not part of I was never part of OFAC, so this isn't self-serving. It's really nice as a taxpayer and American citizen to know that any unit of the U.S. government works at a high level of competence. If OFAC steps on you, you stay flat. And I think, so, I will hold to my statement that there may be ways the Russians can complete Nord Stream 2, but it's not going to be easy, hence our leverage, and then it's a question of how you best use that leverage.
Just on that point too, I would note that the Act does provide for sanctions to be imposed on foreign persons who facilitated deceptive or structured transactions to provide these vessels. So there is certainly the possibility that sanctions could be imposed on the companies that you're talking about, even if they were to receive these items. Allseas sells it.
The seller.
Yes. I mean, I think that that's certainly a possibility here.
So
Yep.
the seller would be sanctioned even after they sold.
It's possible. I think the possibility remains for something like that. Yes.
Okay, terrific. This gentleman right here.
Thank you. My name is Paolo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington. Talking about leverage and talking about the future, nothing has been mentioned about American LNG exports to Europe. I know they're modest, but 10 years ago, one would have been crazy to think about any LNG exports from the United States to anybody. Can this become at any point a significant factor? Clearly, the cost differential between pipe gas and LNG is still significant. But can we foresee increased capacity, which certainly is coming online, that can modify the general picture and to some extent extenuate the adverse effects of the potential blackmail of Russia against Ukraine? Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, LNG sales to Europe from the U.S. or from anywhere else, that's not going to help Ukraine from the standpoint of maintaining Ukraine transit. But from the standpoint of Russian pressure on European countries, it keeps the price down. And just the availability of LNG to Europe, the availability, for example, when the Lithuanians built their terminal at Klaipėda, the Russians dropped their prices by 23%. So it definitely is, will be a factor. The one thing that I don't like when I hear is the Europeans who say that, well, all the Americans only care about Nord Stream 2 because they want to sell LNG. It's the Europeans. When I was energy envoy going back to 2009, the Europeans were begging us to supply LNG. So I think that's really, that part of it's really a false argument. But LNG and other factors, there are any number of other factors that also can mitigate the effect of Russian dominance.
And one, I agree with everything Dick said. Two, LNG could actually also help Ukraine. That is, Ukraine, and this is a major achievement for which Ukraine should get some credit, they don't use Russian gas directly from Russia. I mean, it went from near total dependence to zero. That's a big deal. Ukraine uses Russian gas that it gets through reverse flows from Central Europe, which means it's much harder for the Russians to cut it off, which also means that the increase of gas through LNG into the European market generally benefits Ukraine by loosening up the whole market. So, Ukraine has set its own stage to take advantage of the big shift in energy caused by LNG. And I have little patience for the European arguments that the U.S. is only interested in exports, because I remember European complaints that the Obama administration was not fast enough to give licenses for LNG exports. So, which is it? So this is, there are some real achievements in the European energy picture over the last 10 years. And Ukraine, which has been the victim of our politics, has not gotten enough credit for this major achievement in its energy reorientation.
Thanks, Dan. That's an important point. Okay, the gentle lady in the middle, and then there's another question in front of her. And we have 20 minutes, so just be patient. I will get to you. I see the hands. Thank you. You go first.
I'm
go
first. Ahead. Thank you so much. My name is Ekaterina Sobol. I'm with Russian news agency RIA Novosti. And also the last time news is, according to the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine, they almost reached the deal. I think it's a good news for all of us. So it's a flash. You can read it on your news wires.
In the last 30 minutes?
Yes, Moscow and Ukraine. So it's good. It's going forward. But I also would like to propose you a little different perspective. According to my knowledge, the Eagle Ford and the other places in the United States for right now are burning natural gas because it's less expensive than to deliver it to direct consumer. and overseas as well. So for 3 years, I'm hearing the talks from Secretary Perry, from Lighthizer, and the others, that the U.S. doesn't have enough infrastructure for deliver the natural gas to European Union or to domestic market. Why U.S. doesn't want to fight with Russia with open market tools?
Thanks.
Why? This is the question.
Thanks. Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, I think what you,
Afterwards.
but with respect to U.S. LNG, I mean, there's some. I think you're somewhat accurate as to the willingness to sell gas at very low prices. I think the fact is that U.S. LNG is available, and it can compete a lot better than a lot of people think, even in markets like Europe, and it does create a competitive market, helps to create a competitive market in Europe and keeps prices down, whether it be LNG or from Gazprom or from anybody else. And so your argument makes sense from the standpoint that the European market is becoming more competitive, and as long as Russia follows the rules and acts in a competitive and transparent way, it can compete like anybody else, and there'd be a lot of competition. That's why I keep coming back to the point on Nord Stream. The issue, I think, at the end of the day, is not over dependence on Russian gas, because I think things are happening that are mitigating that situation. And in fact, we have a big project that we're working on that. I think the issue is Ukraine. Belarus maybe as well, and a couple of Eastern European countries perhaps as well. That's the issue. If there were no Ukrainian transit issue, this never would have. I don't think Nord Stream ever would have become an issue, so I guess I at least partly agree with you. I think that there can be a competitive and transparent market in Europe even with Nord Stream 2. But I think in the United States, if you go up to Capitol Hill, what really creates the visceral reaction is the effect on Ukraine. And how can Gazprom be rewarded by eliminating Ukraine as a transit state after what they've done in Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, so forth? I mean, you can argue back and forth on that part of it, but I think that's the visceral reaction that you get on the Hill. Do you agree with that?
Okay, hold on. Someone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, you're Novosti, right? I'm glad to hear you extol the virtues of open market competition, and I hope that reflects a new look by your government.
I believe in that. I'm always U.S. citizen.
Right.
After to survive.
Yes, understood. But just for the record, the Russian government, and I know you don't represent them, has no basis complaining that the U.S. is resorting to non-market methods, presumably sanctions, when Russia has been using energy leverage to squeeze and choke its neighbors, including Ukraine, for some time. And I think an addition, although Ukraine may have been the principal target of Nord Stream 2, I think that Poland and the Baltics is an additional target, plus the objective of reaching Germans to German business and try to solidify the relationship with that part of the German body politic that tends to be soft on Russia. I think those are all factors. None of them have to do with market competition. All of them have to do with the use of energy as leverage for the Kremlin's strategic plans. So let's hope that we get a Russian government which is interested in a market relationship with the rest of the world. That would be good for everybody, the Russians not least.
But do you disagree, Dan? With respect to if, in fact, transit were to continue through Ukraine, Poland, and so forth, this Nord Stream 2 would not have become an issue, and a lot of steps are taking place in Europe now that will force Russia to be competitive from a pricing standpoint in Europe.
I especially agree with the latter part. I don't think that the Russians are going to change unless they have to, but the Europeans at their best are changing the circumstances, and so the Russians will have to do so.
But it's also true that if it was simply economics, Nord Stream 2 probably wouldn't be built, because even Nord Stream 1 has not been used at full capacity. So from every aspect, this is a geopolitical project.
Well, it may or may not be, but it's Ukraine that still creates the issue with Ukraine.
Okay, let's bring in some more questions. Sir, please.
My name is Denis David of Russian Television and Radio Broadcasting Company.
Oh, you guys sit together.
Yeah. According to Atlantic Council website, the U.S. imposes sanctions because of so-called Russian aggression.
Without the so-called.
No. Okay, so-called Russian aggression. And by the way, we have another and I think more realistic viewpoint that the United States is trying to advance.
What's the question, please?
Just a second. Their own commercial interest by pushing more expensive American natural gas. Even though European independent countries asked to respect their choice, I mean Nord Stream 2. In doing so, is the United States not afraid of losing its allies across the Atlantic? And why doesn't the United States want to respect European Union's choice? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Did you not hear the earlier, were you not here for the earlier discussion? It is a matter of record that the Europeans were complaining earlier that the United States was not willing to export enough LNG. So far from the U.S. forcing LNG on unwilling Europeans, as your question implies, the reality is that the Europeans want our LNG and have sought it. The Poles and Lithuanians especially, but others. So I think the premise of your question it brings back my youth dealing with Soviet line about the United States seeking to exploit its European allies, but thankfully I don't have to listen to that without comment anymore.
But what about U.S. commercial interests?
We have them, but they happen to overlap with European interests. We're not forcing anybody to do anything. It happens because Russia has exercised gas leverage and squeezed European countries and caused shortages of LNG for no good reason. Europeans are eager, at least some European countries are eager to have American LNG. So it works out well for everybody, except, of course, some in the Kremlin.
And it's not just American LNG. It can be LNG from Qatar. It can be LNG from anywhere. But what it does is that it creates a floor on pricing, so that, even if American LNG is, let's say, hypothetically, is a couple of dollars more expensive, that keeps any competition, Russian competition or any other piped gas or whatever, from increasing that price to a certain amount. So the Europeans love it.
Terrific.
And it's up to them where they're going to buy it from.
Let's take the question right next to you, Doug, and then the gentleman in the red tie.
Thanks so much. Ryan Orange from Baker McKenzie. I just had a question regarding the NDAA. So clearly Nord Stream is a very big focus of this, but is the TurkStream pipeline is equally as sort of important of a target for these sanctions? And then also, sorry, I have it written down. A lot of talk about all seas as well. Is Saipem as much as a target and sort of will they be sort of considered as like a much of a target as the all seas company is?
Thanks so much. Thanks for bringing up TurkStream. Go ahead, Amy.
So in terms of the scope of the sanctions, absolutely TurkStream is covered. My understanding is that TurkStream is very far along the timeline as far as completion and is quite near completion. And so in terms of practical impact, it seems to me that it's less likely to impact TurkStream, although it does apply to successor projects as well. Yes, it does target TurkStream. Your second question, I'm sorry, I just blanked on it.
You're good. So clearly all seas is...
All seas, yes, okay.
Sort of the same.
So as a technical matter, we don't know yet. I mean, we can sort of anticipate what we think are the companies that are most likely to be targeted by these sanctions. Again, it's the vessels that are engaged in pipe laying at depths of 100 feet or more below sea level. as well as the companies that are providing those vessels, selling, leasing, otherwise providing those vessels. Allseas is known to be contributing to the project. They were engaged by Gazprom to build the pipe, and so they seem like a very likely target here. But nothing has yet been identified. So they'll have 60 days post-signing for the Department of State in consultation with Treasury to identify the sanctions targets. And we don't yet know exactly who will be listed and the exact nature of the sanctions with respect to those particular parties.
There was an interesting article I read in the last day or two on TurkStream that the Russians are getting very frustrated with Bulgaria for delaying the pipeline, and that they're saying, oh well, we'll find other alternatives and so forth. There is an interesting question, and this is a market question more than a political question, whether or not, if TurkStream does take place and gas goes through TurkStream into the Balkans, what effect will that have on the market and other potential gas entries like LNG coming in through Greece, expansion of the Southern Gas Corridor, other possibilities, whether it be KRG, whatever. So just TurkStream is going to be really interesting to watch. It hasn't got nearly as much attention as Nord Stream, but it does deserve a lot of attention.
Great, thank you. Watch this space. Okay,
Black
gentleman
Sea,
back there, please.
which I know you love, Yelda.
Since there was so much talk about the Germans, I think one might just take the floor. Christoph Seemann from the German Embassy. Thanks, John, Dan, and Richard for all your work, and the Atlantic Council in keeping transatlantic relations tight and working together on policies. My question is the following. Why is there so little recognition on what Germany and Europe overall is doing in Ukraine? Because, I think the track record on how we engage diplomatically, economically, and financially in support of Ukraine is pretty clear. We had the talks in Paris on the Normandy summit. I think with regards to the implementation of the Reformed Gas Directive, look at the German law of December 5th. It implements European law 100%. And now look to Berlin, where they reached apparently a gas transit deal, where we always said that we would dive into that and support that. So why isn't there more recognition? And let's talk about how to look forward that this gas transit deal is implemented and upheld. So that would be, I think, my plea for the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
I am a great admirer of Chancellor Merkel's role in dealing with Kremlin aggression in Donbass. She has been absolutely essential on sanctions, and she's provided a steadiness of leadership unparalleled among Western leaders over the past 5 years. Now, that was not, maybe I should have mentioned that earlier, but this was about Nord Stream 2. So you're absolutely right about that. And Germany's role, not just within the context of the Normandy format, and she gave very important support for Zelensky in Paris last week, but also Germany's role, as you mentioned, providing assistance as Ukraine has pushed on reform. And Germany, as we all know, as well as other countries and institutions, were all for getting rid of Schocken, right? To put one, anyway, so this is acknowledged and understood.
And I think the facts are getting twisted on this whole, impeachment situation, where the White House has argued, well, we were holding back lethal assistance because the Europeans aren't doing their share. Well, they're forgetting to mention what you're mentioning, that overall European assistance to Ukraine is significantly greater than comes from the United States, and there's a lack of knowledge of that in the United States that doesn't, so that there isn't, quick pushback on statements like that. There is a little bit on it, but not much. And so I think that it's important that European countries also help get that point across here. That anyway, so your points are basically right.
I agree with my colleagues in their assessment of German leadership. I would add, looking forward, I would like to see Germany take the current mini storm over the Nord Stream 2 sanctions and try to turn this into a positive by working with the U.S. on some sort of measures to help Ukraine underpin continued Russian gas flows through Ukraine, and possibly, and I hope, develop contingency sanctions that we would impose should the Russians either put Ukraine under the knife again or put other European countries, European Union members, under the knife. The fact is that we developed the US-EU, the transatlantic sanctions against the Kremlin for its invasion of Ukraine in close cooperation with the Germans. The precedent is there, and in the paper, and today I was trying to argue for repeating that good pattern, coming up with future options, contingency options, to throw the issue back into the Kremlin so we're not chewing on each other, we're pushing back. And I think that there is something in that space. It'll mean that Germany will have to step up and probably do so outside of a public forum with cameras. I get it. But there is a good German record on Ukraine to build on, with the exception of Nord Stream 2, on which I just think your government made a mistake. But there's there's a firm basis for cooperation and a lot of options. So that's where I'm trying to point things.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan. We have time for one more question. This gentleman right here, please.
Hello, Benjamin Hilgenstock, Institute of International Finance. I wanted to ask a question about the distinction between supply security and the more financial aspects of gas transit through Ukraine. Do you think there's enough recognition in the United States that for Ukraine this is now less a question of supply security, since, as you said, Ambassador Fried, Ukraine is not taking any gas directly from Russia anymore and hasn't for a couple of years, but it is receiving about $3 billion in transit receipts, which reduce the current account deficit and external financing needs. So is there enough recognition of this fact?
I think that the point, it's a point well taken. I don't think, as Dan pointed out, that there are major issues today anyway with respect to supply security. There obviously, to lose $3 billion in transit fees for a country like Ukraine would be significant, but it's more than that. If, in fact, Russia did not have to rely at all on Ukraine for transit and could rely solely on Nord Stream or Turkish Stream, that gives, it seems to me, gives Russia even more leverage over Ukraine politically, because to the extent that they need Ukrainian transit, that at least could be a somewhat of a restraining factor. I'm good.
Terrific. Thank you all so very much for coming. Please put your hands together and help me thank our wonderful experts here today.